Professor Farid Esack, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can. I can also see it.
Okay, wonderful. Sani Bunani, Dumelang, good evening to our South African viewers. Good day to many others around the world. Buenos dias, salam, shalom. We'd like to welcome you all to Africa for Palestine's webinar series on Israeli apartheid through South African eyes. Today's topic with Professor Farid Esack again, who we are very happy and privileged to be speaking with. Today's topic is how applicable is the term apartheid to the state of Israel? My name is Alex, and I'm a volunteer at Africa for Palestine. For those of us who may not be familiar with Africa for Palestine, formerly known as BDS South Africa, Africa for Palestine focuses on strengthening African-Palestinian relations and pushing back against apartheid Israel's infiltration and influence into the continent of Africa. We work with solidarity groups, trade unions, political formations, and human rights organizations across the African continent who have our same spirit of progressive internationalism and commitment to standing with other oppressed peoples all over the world. Our webinar series is being done with Professor Farid Esack. Farid Esack is a South African Muslim liberation theologian, veteran of the South African anti-apartheid struggle, and professor of Islam at the University of Johannesburg. He currently serves on the board of Africa for Palestine. Our topic for tonight is how applicable is the term apartheid to the state of Israel? And to give people just a bit of background in terms of the other topics we've been working through, last week's topic was Jerusalem and the myth of God as a real estate agent. Sorry, that was 2 weeks ago. And last week was the choice to be struck by similarities or to be blind by them. So you can see that we are slowly developing kind of the themes and topics within this series. We're very happy to have you all again this Wednesday. How are you, Professor Farid Esack?
I'm very well, and I'm delighted to be connecting with comrades throughout the world and to be a part of, in a small way, contributing to awareness of apartheid, the occupation, the daily dehumanization suffered by the Palestinians. Struggling to be part of the creation of a new world.
Yes, we hear you, Prof. Farid. So if we can get started with tonight's topic, I think we can start first with the question, Prof. Farid. What do you mean by the term apartheid?
Yeah, okay. What do I mean? You know, often when you say, what do you mean? It's as if a word can have many meanings. Of course, the case, but there is also a point at which you can stretch the meaning of a word that it has got no basis, or it has got no connection to its original meaning. Now, the word apartheid has, of course, for long been connected to South Africa, and most dictionaries affirm this connection. But words, it's part of communication of a species which is dynamic. And as that species move on, words also move on. I just want to use two words or two terms as an example of how words change. The one is the term gender apartheid, and the other is the term Holocaust. I and many of my fellow comrades in the gender justice trenches, we have freely spoken about gender apartheid for many years now. When I Googled the word gender apartheid before this talk, I found 58,000 references on Google to the word gender apartheid.
Wow.
And I've never heard the word gender apartheid being contested or saying, why are you talking about gender apartheid? Apartheid is unique to South Africa, or you are insulting Black people by using the word apartheid in relation to gender apartheid. So words travel. The other interesting word is the Holocaust. Now, the Holocaust is commonly referred to even without any adjectives. You don't speak about the Jewish Holocaust. You don't speak about the Nazi Holocaust. You just say the Holocaust, and everybody knows exactly what you're talking about. And there's been no objection from Zionists to the word Holocaust being used for the crime of unimaginable proportions that have been visited upon the Jews by the Nazis. They've never objected to the word Holocaust being used for this crime, despite the fact that the term was really first used for the slaughter of animals. From the Greek word holocaustos, the word refers in general to an animal offering, and it is marginally found in Greek literature. In the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, used in Leviticus 6, 21 to 22, in the following context, the big pieces of the grain offering you shall offer for a sweet aroma to the Lord. The priest shall offer it. It is a statute forever to the Lord. It shall be completely burned. So completely burned is generally the word used, and it refers, of course, to the complete burning of animals as a sacrifice. Other than that, I mean, the term was used in 1985 to describe the massacre of Armenian Christians by Ottoman Muslims as burnt offering. So the biblical term shoah, which means destruction, became the standard Hebrew word for the murder of the European Jews. And so, for example, in Hebrew, they speak about Yom HaShoah in Israel as Holocaust Remembrance Day. So here, an event that was first applied to animals is now appropriated for the destruction or the massacre of more than 6 million Jews. So first, this word was confined to the genocide of the Jews, slightly more than half of the number of the victims of the Nazi genocide. And initially, it was excluded the 5 million others who were killed. And so many Zionists have bitterly resisted the application of the Holocaust to any other massacres. So a word that never belonged to Jewish history, for many of them can now only be used for Jewish history. And the same kind of logic they want to impose on the people of South Africa by saying that the word apartheid can only be applied to your history. Now, of course, there is this perfectly legitimate determination on the part of many Jewish people, it should be on the part of all Jewish people, to keep the memory of one's own people alive. This is legitimate. But intermingled with this legitimacy is a sad, miserable, and a self-absorbed obsession to deny the memory and experience of others. And for me, it really is a question of both a calculated political engineering on the one hand, and on the other hand, it's a meanness, a shallowness of spirit on the other. This logic of self-absorption, only me, mine is bigger than yours. And in this case, my pain is bigger than yours. This is so tragically reflected today, more visibly than anywhere else, in that pathetic specimen of humanity that is leading the United States. But this self-absorption, it is quite unbecoming of any community which claims its mooring is in universal ethics and values. So words change, and they can be applied to similar or identical situations.
So, Prof. Esack, might you say that this logic of self-absorption that you're getting at, is this possibly at the heart of why Zionists resist arguing that describing Israel as an apartheid state is an insult to the people of South Africa?
Yes, I think this is why they resist the idea, why they refuse to describe Israel as an apartheid South Africa, and why they argue that to do so is an insult to the people of South Africa, absolutely. And I think for a number of reasons, it's a damn cheek of Israeli apartheid supporters to suggest that applying this term to South Africa is an insult to the people of South Africa. It's a bit like Donald Trump suddenly turning into a Black Lives Matter activist and then claiming that he needs his wall on the Mexican border in order to protect Black American lives from the Mexicans or other Latinos. First of all, this business of elevating our own victimhood above the victimhood of others has mercifully not been a trait of the South African people. The South African story is not one of claiming uniqueness, but it is one of solidarity with the dispossessed, the occupied, and the marginalized. And this is why in UN forums, officially our Department of International Relations and Cooperation, we take sides, the side of Cuba, the side of Venezuela, the sides of the Sahrawis, the sides of the Palestinians. This is our narrative. Not to say, no, our story, we were better victims than you, we were more valuable victims than what, this has never been our narrative. Secondly, let's have a look at where this objection to applying the term apartheid to Israel comes from. It comes from South African Zionists specifically and other Zionists in general. Now, the vast majority of South African Jews, with some heroic, courageous, and noble exceptions, individual Jews, and all of institutionalized Jewry in South Africa, without exception, supported apartheid. They did so explicitly, or they did so tacitly, or by withholding any recognition of or support for anti-apartheid activity. Then, Israel was the second or the third largest supplier of arms to the apartheid war machinery. And finally, Israel, along with the United States, were the two countries most consistent in their defense of apartheid South Africa at various forums. So given this, it's a bit rich for this crowd to tell us what is insulting to Black South Africans and what isn't, and whether it is offensive to us who survived and endured under apartheid, to actually be applying the same term to another state with identical policies, and worse, the state of Israel.
Sure. What you're sharing is very helpful in terms of just thinking of a wider picture of what does the Holocaust mean? What does apartheid mean? What does colonialism mean? And I know I kind of asked you this in the beginning. What do you mean by apartheid? So this may seem redundant, but how do you actually define apartheid as a word?
Yeah, okay. Linguistically, I mean, I find a meaning, well, I've got some dictionary meanings in front of me, but one scholar, Anthony Lausted, defines apartheid like this: the distinctive characteristic of apartheid and of other kinds of oppressive segregation is that political, economic, social, and even geographic conditions are created consciously and systemically in order to forcibly separate groups, invariably to the benefit of at least one of the groups, but never or only accidentally to the benefit of all. Now, the interesting thing is that most dictionaries, and I've just got 3 examples in front of me, but I looked at about 6, 7, most dictionaries affirm the connection between the word apartheid in its South African origins, and every single one also affirm the wider application of the word to other forms of discrimination. The Merriam-Webster dictionary, for example, racial segregation, specifically a form of policy of segregation and political and economic discrimination against non-European groups in South Africa, that's 1. 2, separation, segregation, examples, cultural apartheid, gender apartheid. I'll just quote one more, the Oxford Dictionary. The first meaning, in South Africa, a policy or system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race. 2, segregation on the grounds other than race, sexual apartheid. So in terms of dictionary meanings, it is quite clear that the word can be applied to other situations. But that's for the linguistic definitions that you may have wanted to, that you may have intended by your question.
Yes, no, that was exactly what I was looking for, Professor. So that's helpful in the kind of larger meaning of defining apartheid, but what did apartheid mean in the South African context specifically?
In the South African context, apartheid was a policy of segregation, stratification, putting one above the other, and discrimination based on tribal, ethnic, caste, and or race affiliation. Identified most closely with the Nationalist Party, a Nazi party, or a Nazi supporting party, which came to power in 1948, the same year that Israel was established. There were, however, a series of measures enforcing such policies in place well before this, which the nationalists systematically fine-tuned and expanded. While there was very broadly speaking a white and a non-white division at various stages of the evolution of the different components of the groups that were assigned different privileges. So you could speak about black and white, or in apartheid terms, European and non-European. It's like, you know, you define people in terms of the other, not in terms of their own identity. And some examples of these nuances was South Africans of Indian origin, they couldn't live in or even stay overnight in the Orange Free State, which was one of the 4 provinces that there was before our new democracy. Only people of Malay origin. Now, the people of Malay origin are one of 7 categories of colored people. There were 7 categories of colored people, and they were all named. One of them was named Malay, but there was also a 7th category in case they couldn't fit you into one of the earlier 6, and that was other colored. So in one area of Cape Town known as the Boer Kaap or the Malay quarters, only Malay people were allowed to live there. That's on the slopes of Signal Hill in Cape Town. And then there was a distinction between the rights of urban blacks and rural blacks. And then colored people were actually allowed to vote, although on a separate voters' roll, until 1951. One final distinction was that in the Cape province, that was a preferential labor area for colored people. Blacks weren't were discouraged, weren't allowed to work there. Coloureds were preferred to work there. And in the province of Natal, Indians were. So from the outside, it may seem like, oh, it was just black and white, but it was a very, very complex system. And the system that held all of these various laws, regulations, and policies together, that was called apartheid, with its multi-layered scales of dehumanization, depending on where a particular ethnic group was located in relation to the economic, political, and security needs of the whites. And this is important. None of these groups had a value or an identity of their own. They were treated, laws were legislated, places were found for them in relation to the needs, the political, the economic, security needs of the Jeren volk. That's German for the chosen people. As I said last week, or in my first lecture, that there's a sacred conversation between this group and God, and all the other people are just eavesdroppers. So this thing was central, their political, economic, and security needs. Everything else is peripheral or of no consequence. The second thing, and let me just end this question on this, this is the defining thing about apartheid, the subjection of one ethnic group to the demands and the needs of the other. Now, the vast majority of the former, the chosen ethnic group, what makes it worse? It is in South Africa, not just the vast majority, all of the ethnic group, who's now the dominant ethnic group, they were new to the land, and they were a minority in the land, which only made it worse. In the case of Israel, of course, the vast majority of the dominating class, the chosen ethnic group, is relatively new. And this we must be clear about. As I've often said, Jews have lived in Israel since the beginning of the history of that part of the world. But this doesn't mean that all Jews throughout the world are now citizens of this part of the world. Mm. And so you've got the one crime of discrimination masquerading as differentiation or mere separation. And added to this is the crimes of dispossession and occupation.
Hmm. So that's very helpful, Professor Esack, in terms of understanding inside South Africa what apartheid meant to people. How would a typical foreign visitor, though, have responded to seeing and experiencing all of this when visiting apartheid South Africa?
Yeah, in response to your question, one can say exactly the same about a typical foreign visitor to Palestine and to Israel. But I think I dealt with this at some length in my previous lecture or the one before. So during the apartheid era, a visitor, say for example, the very picturesque Malay Quarter, Boerkaap, that features on many postcards. It's one of those beautiful parts of South Africa. It's a really prominent tourist area on the slopes of Table Mountain, with its quaint, colorful houses, cobblestone streets, and 13 mosques. They would have found a wonderfully settled community, warmly welcoming them. Look at these lovely Malay people your tour guide would have been able to point out. You could have gone on to describe their festivals, their weddings, their music, and their centuries of exotic culinary traditions. And all of these were true, yes. But that community survival, the decision to ban Indian Muslims and all non-Muslims from owning property in that area, and the arbitrary decision to let these particular Malay people be. This was also manifestations of apartheid. But the other side of the truth was just down the road, where you find District 6, where there were family members and friends living for more than 100 years until the group areas came along in the 1960s and decided that only whites could live there. Uprooted, their homes destroyed by bulldozers, while the bereft inhabitants and the world looked on. They were forced to find refuge in windswept townships of the Cape Flats. And there the wounds continue to fester nearly 60 years after the forced removal, this ethnic cleansing. So you are a victim of the tour guides. You are the victim of the millions of dollars that the Israeli government spent in tourist brochures to force you to see what they want you to see. And that is, yes, that is what the typical tourist to South Africa would have seen.
So, I mean, you just said a word there, Professor Esack, ethnic cleansing. I mean, that immediately brings to mind the context of occupied Palestine, of apartheid Israel. Can we compare the Palestinian situation to apartheid? Professor Esack, are you still with me?
Yes, I am. Are you with me?
Yes, we're with you.
Can you hear me? Okay, fine. I mean, look, I and countless of others, in the previous things, I mentioned about how when I first arrived in Karachi, I wondered where the women were, and how I was disturbed at the public beaches when I noticed women huddled in small groups, the edge of public spaces, among the rockier parts of the beach, in desperate attempts to make themselves invisible, lest their womanhood by itself become a cause of provocation. And I thought, gosh, this is my home, my apartheid home. This is my having to become invisible in front of white folks, lest I provoked by my mere public existence in the way Black people in the United States today provoked by their mere public existence. So I and countless of others who share my struggle background, in looking at Israel, we recognize that it is an apartheid state, and we recognize it as a state that practices apartheid in some aspects, in some respects on a scale pretty much the same, and in some other cases, worse than what we experienced in South Africa. Have you lost me?
Sorry, you just froze for a moment.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can hear you, Professor. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, I can. Do you want to move on to the next question, or shall I continue?
Yes. No, I can. I heard you finish that last part and then it went blank. Okay, so clearly it's very similar. There's many similarities. So, I mean, do Jews find this comparison, in your experience, do Jews find this comparison deeply offensive when you mention these deep connections between the various parts of various apartheids in Israel and South Africa?
I think the vast majority of Jews, not all, but to the extent that the vast majority of Jews are also Zionists. So it is usually met with a deep sense of effrontery by Zionists, including Zionists who describe themselves as committed to the peace process. They variously argue that this comparison is offensive, that it is alienating, that it is counterproductive, that it is an unhelpful analogy that doesn't admit to the complexity of the issues. For many of the more thoughtful among them, though, the question is often not whether the comparison can be made or not, but that it is. And even for those who object to the apartheid analogy, the South African experience is seldom far when speaking about Palestine, when speaking about the Israeli-Palestinian situation. And this is evident from the anxieties about, how do we prevent another South Africa? Or sometimes in, how do we prevent things from getting so bad that it becomes an apartheid state? And at other times, how do we present the emergence of a state wherein all groups will be equal as citizens, and of course, the concomitant loss of this Jewish uniqueness. And sometimes like, we don't have a Palestinian Mandela. Or they'll ask, why is Hamas not like the ANC? And sometimes there is a forced aversion to describing Israel in a particular way. Ami Ayalon, a former head of Israel's General Security Service, says, I don't like the word separation. It reminds me of South Africa. So it's the word that they are afraid of, not the reality of apartheid. So what is clear is that most Zionists find the A word deeply offensive when used in relation to Israel, and that it is a significant deterrent to any attempt to have a serious conversation with them. Words can amplify and sometimes painful. It is then used easier on our conscience, particularly if that conscience is itself light, as in Coke Light or Marlboro Light. So perhaps in moving beyond my problem with the word separation, or their problem with the word separation, they must flee from separation itself. Greater than my determination to dodge accusations of sexism should be my commitment to uncover it in my life and to work against it.
Sure. Sorry, Prof. I was just seeing some comments here on our feed that the connection seems to be freezing a lot. I'm not sure if the problem may be on your side or my side. Might you possibly have another place that you can live stream?
Yes, I'll switch places.
Okay. Okay, sorry to our viewers. We're just trying to make sure that you guys can actually hear us.
Am I visible?
Yes, you are visible, Prof.
Okay.
Okay, let's hope that does the trick. Are we good to go?
Yes, we are good to go.
Okay, so if we can get back.
Yes, I'm listening.
If we can get back to our discussion, and I know it may seem that we continue to ask this in different ways, but let's get to the bottom of this. I mean, this is the topic for tonight: apartheid, what it means, the different ways it's connected to the two contexts. Are you suggesting, Professor Esack, that apartness is unique to Israel?
No, 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 of course not. Any churchgoer in the United States can testify how apartness is visible, endemic on Sunday in church. Even in the post-apartheid South Africa, the vast majority of white people have never been in a black or colored township. Most coloreds and Indians have never been in a black one. So, but when apartness and ethnicity is elevated to dogma and ideology, when these are enforced through law and its agencies, and when all of this is done at the expense of the vast majority of the inhabitants of the land, then we are dealing with apartheid, regardless of how genuine the trauma that gave birth to it, or the religious depth of the exclusivist beliefs underpinning it. And this is what happened in apartheid South Africa, and this is what is happening today in apartheid Israel.
So, Professor Esack, given that you are a scholar activist, how would you say that Israel/South Africa, this comparison is being used today in both academic and activist circles?
There are two colleagues of mine, the one, well, South African, and the other one is Canadian, although both of them are now based in Vancouver, Heribert Adam and Cordilla Mudley, in a work of theirs called Seeking Mandela, Peacemaking Between Israelis and the Palestinians. They use the idea of motive to divide commentary on the question of Israeli apartheid, and this analogy into three groups. A majority incensed by the very analogy and deplores what it deems its propagandistic goals. Second is Israeli apartheid advocates, including most Palestinians, many third world academics, and several Jewish post-Zionists who idealistically predict an ultimate South African solution of a common or binational state. And then there's a third group who sees both similarities and differences, and which looks to South African history for guidance in bringing a resolution to the conflict between Israel and Palestine. But there is, of course, in the activist world, the discourse of Israel as an apartheid state. It is an important element of our discourse, but it's not just the product of our fanciful activist imaginations. If I can, it's difficult to trace when exactly the description of Israel as an apartheid state or Israeli apartheid was first used, but it is an integral part of our ordinary vocabulary of Palestinians and those acting in solidarity with them. Even before this word became common, Bantustan, the word Bantustan was routinely used for how Palestine was being carved up in the early 90s. The International Court had described this wall, not sure, of Trumpian epic, how this, it was spoken about as an apartheid wall. I think the former book, the book by the former US President Jimmy Carter, Palestine, Peace, Not Apartheid, and the reports by John Dugard, they've all made the idea common that, that the Palestinian experience is something akin, if not worse, to what South Africans have experienced under apartheid. Look, with very, very few exceptions, South Africans who have participated in the South African liberation struggle and who have been to Palestine and Israel, they've been struck by this nearly all-pervasive sense, man, this is exactly what we have lived through and fought against all our lives. It's possibly worse. A South African trade union leader described Israel as a Sunday school picnic in relation to South Africa. So, I mean, I look at this as somebody who's lived under apartheid, and I genuinely believe that the Palestinians are subjected to a more brutal form of injustice than what has been, than what we have experienced. And this has been echoed by a large number of other Jewish South Africans also. Some of them who've actually lived in Israel, Israeli journalists, scholars, and human rights activists. So it's become fairly, it's passé. It's common amongst us to see this South African Jewish Voices for Peace, other Jewish activists, leading amongst them Ronnie Kasserol's, Max Ozinski, number of Jewish activists say that what they've experienced there or what they've seen there, it's much worse than what we had experienced in South Africa.
Sure, that's very helpful, Prof. Esack.
Alex, if perhaps we could make the next question the last one, and I'm sorry about the disruption that we had. I just fear that we're going a bit over time.
Okay, no, I was on the same page, Prof. Farid. Okay, let me just see. If I can possibly ask maybe just kind of two questions in one to end our topic for tonight. The first one is, what does the Israeli left make of this apartheid analogy, given that they generally leftists are supposed to be those who are moving more towards egalitarianism and equality in society? And the second question is, can you maybe just give us a kind of overview of the similarities and differences in the systems of apartheid that you shared with us tonight?
Yeah, difficult to combine both of them, but I'll be quick. Well, first of all, I mean, it's a bit like sometimes, you know, when we're in South Africa and looking at the United States and then seeing the Democratic Party being described as a left party, it's like quite embarrassing to the term left. And I dare say that this applies to most of Israel itself about what can be described as left. It's a shadow of what is in other parts of the world regarded as a left. But let's say some people not so far right. It is increasingly used in relation to the various contours. In terms of time, some argue that this is the current de facto Israeli situation, while an increasing number argue and warn that it is on its way to becoming one. In terms of space, meaning as in place, some make a sharp distinction between Israel proper and the occupied territories. In Israel proper, they assert that it's mostly a democratic and egalitarian state. And in the case of the latter, they will concede that it has unpleasant dimensions to it. But that this dimension, they will say, is born from the problem of occupation rather than a direct consequence of Zionism. And I may want to come back to this point in a moment. And so the solution for them is that Israel must get rid of the occupied territories and deal with some social inequality issues inside Israel proper. And the third contour is that of looking at a specific measure, a law or an act, and to describe that rather than the entire Israeli political system and its underlying ideology as akin to apartheid. Alex, if I can avoid the other part of your question and just make a final point, and then we could continue a more specific look at laws, at measures similar to apartheid, similar to Israel, differences in apartheid, differences in Israel, in a much more factual way next week. The one point that I want to make is this, that for me, any ideology that is based on a preferential treatment for a people on the basis of their birth and the accident of biology, such a state must necessarily enact various measures to increase the population of the one and diminish the population of the other. So when you say that this state is founded for the Jews of the world, then the concomitant, the inevitable corollary is this, that this state must engage in ethnic cleansing. You can't, on the one hand, say that we are created in order to make space for all of this particular community in the world. This is the raison d'être. This is the reason why we are created, to make space for everybody else like us. If South Africa was created for all the white people of the world, they had to find a problem. They had to find a solution to the problem of the black people. And you couldn't just speak about the black-white problem. You had to speak about the black problem. And so Israel, by its very founding, has to have a Palestinian problem. And the only answer to that problem, if you look at the basic law of the state, the reason for the existence of the state is the ingathering of the Jews. The only and the inevitable answer to that, at best, second-class citizenship, hiding there in the dark, occasionally pulling out one of you, a Druze, making you a judge and saying, oh, no, for like, a bit of a poster boy. No, we also have Arabs in government. But the logical outcome of any state that is founded for a particular race, the logical outcome of this can only be ethnic cleansing for those who don't fit into this category that you have designated, or your definition of what is meant by this racial group. And in Israel, it is your mother was a Jew, or you converted to Judaism through a process recognized largely by the Orthodox rabbinate. If I could end on that note, Alex, and we can see how we continue the conversation next week.
Okay, sure. That's perfectly fine, Professor Esack. I think we worked through a solid amount of questions. And yeah, I think we covered the ground for our topic today. So thank you very, very much for your time yet again. We hope you're not getting tired by showing up every week on this Wednesday. It doesn't seem like you are.
I'm good at pretending.
Okay. Baya shukran, toda, gracias. Thank you, Professor Farid Esack, and to all of our viewers for tuning in and joining in Africa for Palestine's weekly webinar series on Israeli apartheid through South African eyes. We will see you next week on Wednesday, Professor Esack. And to all of our viewers, the topic for next week is apartheid, the chosen people and the colonization of God. So please tune in and check out Africa for Palestine's social media. You will view our webinar on the same exact place at the same time, and the times are listed on our flyers. And one last thing before we say our goodbyes today or tonight, just a reminder, and apologies, this is only for our South African-based supporters and viewers. Don't forget, we are selling these Palestinian kufiye face masks to wear during the COVID-19 crisis. These face masks are really, really comfortable. They're made from the Palestinian scarves in Palestine and manufactured here in South Africa. So you are supporting both Palestine and the local economy. You can check out Africa for Palestine's social media pages on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram to find out how to purchase one. They are 90 Rand. And they look cool. So, okay, thank you all very much. Take care, and we'll see you next week. Amandla.
Where to?